So good morning to everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to address you this morning on this very important issue of Hizballah as an example of a case study, so to speak, of a Shia Islamist movement from which a great deal, I think, can be learned. Not only about Hizballah itself, which to some degree one could argue may be seen as a kind of parochial interest of us that are based in the Levant, but also, of course, more importantly, of the large state-led alliance of which Lebanese Hizballah is a part, the alliance, of course, led by Islamic Republic of Iran. Before I begin then with regard to Hizballah and the Jews, let's just remind ourselves of who we're talking about. What is Hizballah? Where does it come from? What does it consist of? Lebanese Hizballah, of course, a Shia Islamist movement founded in 1982 by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, inside Lebanon. Iran dispatched 1,500 officers of IRGC to the Bekaa, the Lebanese Bekaa Valley, in 1982 in order to create a franchise or proxy of IRGC inside Lebanon, and that is Lebanese Hizballah. 40 years or 30-something years on from that, Lebanese Hizballah is the great success of the outstanding success of the outreach program, if one can put it that way, of Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Today it has somewhere between 35 to 50,000 fighters. It is by far the most powerful military force in Lebanon. It is also by far the most powerful political force in that country. That is to say, Hizballah today in Lebanon controls, or is part of the bloc, or dominates the bloc that controls the majority in the 128-member Lebanese parliament. It is part of the bloc that controls the majority in the Lebanese cabinet. Its associates or minions are at the head of all three of Lebanon's intelligence organizations. It is deeply involved inside the Lebanese armed forces, that is to say the official armed forces of the Lebanese state, and it is also deeply involved in the Lebanese economy and banking and finance systems. Indeed, to my view at least, the most cogent way of seeing Hizballah in Lebanon today is to see Hizballah as a kind of deep state within Lebanon. The usage of the phrase in this context is not mine. It was made by a Lebanese colleague of mine, and I found it to be particularly insightful. That's to say, if we think of what do we mean when we say a deep state, we mean an entity which has burrowed its way into the official state. And while the official state and its institutions continue to exist, the deep state is the thing that, often unseen, controls the key nodes of power in the polity in question. That, it seems to me, it's an unusual way, but I think it's probably the most insightful way today to conceptualize what Hizballah is doing inside Lebanon. Thus far then, with regard to the movement itself, I'm going to now turn to focus quite closely on Hizballah's attitudes towards the Jews. And I'm going to begin with a quote from Hizballah General Secretary Said Hassan Nasrallah, which I think is a good way in to beginning to understand the very specific and particular attitude towards the Jews and hence towards Israel, which Hizballah adheres to. So this is Nasrallah speaking, and he says, "But I'll tell you, among the signs and signals which guide us in the Islamic prophecies is that this state of Israel will be established and that the Jews will gather from all parts of the world into occupied Palestine, not in order to bring about the Dajjal, the Antichrist, and the end of the world, but rather that Allah, the glorified and Most High, wants to save you from having to go to the ends of the world, for they have gathered in one place, and there the final and decisive battle will take place. This is Hizballah General Secretary, as I said, Nasrallah, speaking before an audience in Beirut in 2002. And much of Hizballah's attitude towards the Jews may be discerned, I would suggest, from this quote. This statement and the movement's outlook regarding the Jews manages a kind of seamless combination of anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish sentiment, in which the politicidal ambitions regarding Israel are frankly and unambiguously located within an anti-Jewish worldview. This worldview, in turn, is theological and essentialist. Israel is seen as iniquitous in nature, not because it represents a deviation from Jewish doctrines or essence, as is the case in some other anti-Zionist formulations emerging from both the West and the Islamic Middle East, but rather because it is the realization of them as foreseen, according to Nasrallah, in both Islamic and other scripture. In this regard, Hizballah's anti-Semitism is quite separate from a notable Western strain of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism, which seeks to argue for the inauthenticity of Israel, and which dismisses modern Jewish or Israeli claims to commonality with ancient Israel as spurious or constructed. It's interesting to note, this is a bit of an aside, but it's interesting to note the possible derivation of views of that kind from a Christian supersessionist outlook, which regards the Jews as having completed their historic role and therefore possessing no justifiable claim for continued communal existence. Such views usually seek to depict Israel as a phenomenon analogous to Western settler colonialism, lacking any deep roots in Jewish history or in the Levant region. Hizballah makes no such claims. It does not regard modern Israel as a solely modern phenomenon, falsely claiming links to the ancient Jews for the purpose of justifying a settler colonial project. Rather, Hizballah pays Israel and Zionism the dubious compliment of locating both as entirely authentic, historically and theologically rooted expressions of the Jewish communal essence. It then goes on to define this essence as entirely evil and nefarious in nature and destined to make war against the Islamic world until it is defeated by the latter. This vision, as we shall go on to see, lies at the root of Hizballah's perception of the Jews and Israel. This view differs also from the usual formal declaration of Arab or Islamic anti-Zionism, according to which Jews, as a people of the book, have a legitimate and respected place as a religious minority, but no national rights. Interestingly, Hizballah leaders do sometimes pay lip service to the latter view. As we shall see, one may locate various statements by Hizballah's spokesmen and leaders expressly denying accusations of anti-Jewish prejudice on the part of the movement, and rather declaring acceptance of the Jews as one of the peoples of the book, deserving of the right to a peaceful communal life under Islamic rule and to freedom of worship. But these statements go together with other statements, common statements expressing a profoundly deep hostility to Jews as a collective of any kind. How can one explain this apparent contradiction? Should it be concluded that Hizballah's spokesmen are simply lying when rejecting claims of anti-Jewish prejudice because they are aware of the negative publicity effects this could generate for the movement in the West, in an arena where the relative tolerance of Western governments for the movement's activities has proven of clear benefit for Hizballah? And if so, what are the roots, Islamic or otherwise, of the movement's authentic, virulently anti-Semitic stance? Or is there a way whereby these two apparently contradictory stances can be reconciled? That is, whereby a coherent ideological outlook might be assembled according to which the Jews are an evil and iniquitous communal body and are nevertheless to be permitted a legitimate, if powerless, communal existence under certain conditions. Examining this question requires a deeper look at the form, the roots, and the expressions of Hizballah's stance regarding the Jews and Israel, which I want to now enter into. So I want to look at the roots of Hizballah's anti-Semitic outlook. Sheikh Naim Qassem, a senior Hizballah official, sometimes described as the second in command of the movement, in his book Hizballah, The Story from Within, characterizes the motivations behind Zionism in the following terms. Quote, "The Zionist project was formed with a focus on religious fanaticism and Semitic prejudice, using the most dreadful of methods to achieve the project's aims." And elsewhere, quote, "The basic foundations of the racially prejudiced Zionist movement is expansion, an aim supported by religious foundations drawn from the Torah. According to the Torah," this is Sheikh Naim Qassem speaking, "Palestine is an inheritance for the people of Israel, whose lives will not stabilize except through the expulsion of Palestine's original inhabitants." Similarly, Ayatollah Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, one of the chief ideological fathers of Hizballah, locates this supposed motivation of Zionism within a supposed inherent Jewish desire for power. And this is quoting from Fadlallah. "The Jews want to be a world superpower. This racist circle of Jews wants to take vengeance on the whole world for their history of persecution and humiliation. In this light, the Jews will work on the basis that Jewish interests are above all world interests. No one should imagine that the Jews act on behalf of any super or minor power. It is their personality to make for themselves a future world presence." Later, Naim Qassem discusses what he regards as the dangers to the Muslims of the region represented by Israel. This discussion too is rooted in an Islamic theological view which views the Jews as a uniquely cunning and malicious enemy. Naim Qassem in this discussion cites two other figures, each of whom, as we shall see, is essential in understanding Hizballah's views on Israel and the Jews, namely Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran and the mythical, revered figure of the 12th Imam, Imam al-Mahdi, whose reappearance in 12 Shia eschatology is meant to trigger the end days. Let me just get my copy of Naim Qassem's book because I want to read a passage to you from that book to give you a better sense of all this. So this is Naim Qassem's book. In England in the old days, in kids' programs, they used to say, "Here's one I prepared earlier." So here's one I prepared earlier. Okay, so from Naim Qassem. Regarding the religious obligation, Jerusalem is the birthplace of the prophets and the land on which Prophet Muhammad treaded. And here's quoting from the Quran, from Surah number 17. "Glory to Allah who did take his servant for journey by night from the sacred mosque to the farthest mosque," that is Al-Aqsa, in Jerusalem, or as later decided to be in Jerusalem, "whose precincts we did bless in order that we might show him some of our signs, for he is the one who heareth and seeth all things." Close quote from the Quran. It is not permissible, this is Qassem again, it is not permissible to squander the land of Muslims or that which is sanctified. Rising to their defense and liberation is a natural obligation for which all Muslims are liable, as Imam Khomeini declared. And this is now Qassem quoting Khomeini's writing. this is Khomeini speaking, that's to say, the extortionist government of Israel, through its tendentious plans for Islamic nations and Muslims, represents a great danger. It is feared that confrontation may become impossible should Muslims show lassitude. Given that the danger is directed at the very essence of Islam, it is the duty of all Muslims, and specifically of Islamic states, to take the initiative for the obliteration of this pond of decay with all possible means, and not to decline the Mujahideen any assistance toward this end. Close quote from Khomeini. Qasim continues, such danger has persisted and continues to manifest in destruction throughout our entire region, not to mention in the pain we have suffered as a result. We have been promised victory, for in God Almighty's words, and here Qasim continues with a quote from Surah number 17 of the Quran once more, and we decreed for the children of Israel in the scripture, ye verily will work corruption in the earth twice, and you will become great tyrants. So when the time for the first of the two came, we roused against you slaves of ours of great might, who ravaged your country, and it was a threat performed. Then we gave you once again your turn against them, and we aided you with wealth and children, and made you more in soldiery. If you do good for your own souls, and if you do evil, it is for them in like manner. So when the time for the second of the judgments came, we roused against you others of our slaves to ravage you, and to enter the temple, even as they entered it the first time, and to lay waste all that they conquered with an utter wasting. It may be that your Lord will have mercy on you, but if you repeat the crime, we shall repeat the punishment. And we have appointed hell a dungeon for the disbelievers. Qasim continues, the role of those who persevere and resist in and around the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem is mentioned in the accounts of the Prophet. One sect of my people shall uphold their religion, conquer their enemy, and will never be harmed by any assailant except that which befalls them of distress and hardship, and they will remain as such until God's order comes unto them. Qasim continues, when asked where this party is, the Prophet said, in Bayt al-Maqdis, in Jerusalem and under its wings. Tradition also speaks of the appearance of the 12th Imam, Imam al-Mahdi, who will work to purify Jerusalem. Accounts quoted from the Prophet state, a man of my people, treading on my path and tradition, shall emerge. God shall bestow heavenly grace on him, and the land shall offer its benediction. He will disseminate justice on the land that will by then be a haven for tyranny. He works for 7 years on this nation. He reaches Bayt al-Maqdis, and Qasim concludes, therefore there is no separation between the religious duty of liberating Palestine and the godly promise of victory. Both represent sufficient motive for resistance and jihad and for refuting the current reality despite the challenges and perils. Thus far with regard to Naim Qasim. Certainly. This is called Hizballah, The Story from Within, the author Naim Qasim. And this is really, in the English language at least, by far the best introduction to, written of course by a very senior official, probably the number 2 official in the movement, regarding this movement's ideology and outlook. So there we have what I would suggest at least to be the essential components of Hizbollah's view on this subject, in greater detail this time cogently expressed. What are these essential details? Note them once more. An essential Jewish identity seen as the causal factor behind Zionism and the establishment of Israel, the location of the understanding of this identity in Islamic texts, and importantly, the location of the resistance to this entity to end in its destruction in a specific 12 Shia eschatology. With your permission, I'm going to quote from another very authoritative and interesting book on this subject. It'll be the last quote from books, I promise, but it's, I think, informative. And the book I want to quote from now to expand, so to speak, on this subject is by a researcher called Amal Saad Ghorayeb. She may be familiar to some people here, and I put her name on the reading list for this lecture. Amal Saad Ghorayeb is a British-Lebanese researcher, and she is a supporter of Hizballah. she wouldn't deny that. I mean, she's openly supportive or sympathetic to the movement. And she sums up the point we're developing here in the following terms. Let me just get my Saad Ghuraib. Where are we? So Saad Ghuraib develops this point. Again, to be clear, the point that I'm trying to draw out here is the specific way in which for Hizballah, Jewish identity and the issue of Israel and Zionism, which is a key political issue for them, are completely intertwined and inseparable. There's no separating the one from the two. And this is the essential point, I think, in grasping the particular nature of this movement's attitude in this subject. So Amal Saad Ghuraib says, one may contend that the synonymity of the two terms, that is Zionism and Judaism, in Hizballah's lexicon, and the general equation of Zionism with Judaism merely signify that all Zionists are necessarily Jews, although doubtless the party would admit to the existence of non-Jewish Zionists, rather than indicate that all Jews are Zionists. However, to do so would be to ignore the party's extensive derogation of Judaism as a religion, irrespective of its Zionist offshoot. In light of the party's anti-Judaism, its claim to differentiate Judaism from Zionism becomes purely academic. Even if some Jews do not espouse Zionism, their religion is still rejected. Whether or not Jews champion Zionism is therefore immaterial, for their religion is held responsible for the birth of Zionism. That the overwhelming majority of Jews happen to be Zionists, by Hizballah's reckoning, only highlights the Judaic origins of Zionism and greatly facilitates the close identification between two doctrines which are perceived to be equally iniquitous. And Amal Saad Ghuraib goes further or develops the point in the following paragraph. Bearing these considerations in mind, it becomes easier to discern Hizballah's attempts to Judaize Zionism and the Israeli state, as when it proclaims the dreams of the Bani Israel, the sons of Israel, are over. These attempts are also manifest in the party's transference of supposed negative Jewish traits to Zionism and Israeli society. This tendency is best exemplified in one of Nasrallah's diatribes against Israel, and this is Amal Saad Ghuraib quoting Nasrallah, where Nasrallah says, "If we search the entire world for a person more cowardly, despicable, weak and feeble in psyche, mind, ideology and religion, we would not find anyone like the Jew. Notice, I do not say the Israeli." Close quotes from Nasrallah. Nasrallah does not mean that these traits do not apply to the Israeli, Amal Saad Ghuraib helpfully notes. For Hizballah, they define the very essence of the Israeli, but only insofar as he has inherited them from his Judaic background in which they originate. Close quote from Amal Saad Ghuraib. In practice, this conflation of the establishment and existence of Israel with the supposedly nefarious, power-seeking plans of the Jews opens the door to the embrace by Hizballah of a variety of forms of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic rhetoric, including elements which have no relation of any kind to Hizballah's own core Shia Islamist outlook. And indeed, a perusal of statements and programming by Hizballah propaganda outlets and by the movement's spokespeople and leaders, unsurprisingly, rapidly produces a rich harvest of classical anti-Semitic prejudice, indistinguishable in many ways from the traditional language of the European far right, or indeed, I suppose nowadays I should also add, the European far left. Here is a taster for our enjoyment in the morning of this phenomenon. So in a 1998 speech marking the day of Ashura, the Shia festival of Ashura, and published in Hassan Nasrallah's official website at that time, Nasrallah refers to Israel as, quote, the state of the grandsons of apes and pigs, the Zionist Jews. Amal Saad Ghuraib quotes once again Naim Qasim as saying, quote, the history of Jews has proven that regardless of the Zionist proposal, they are a people who are evil in their ideas, close quote. Hizballah celebrates Holocaust denial, also in its official outlets. Jews, quoting again, Jews invented the legend of the Holocaust, says once again Nasrallah on April 9th, 2000. During an appearance on Al-Manar, which is Hizbollah's TV channel, on February 3rd, Nasrallah calls Europe's leading Holocaust denier, Roger Giraudi, quote, a great French philosopher. On February 23rd, Nasrallah, once again appearing on Al-Manar, praises another leading European Holocaust denier, David Irving, for having, quote, denied the existence of gas chambers, close quote. One fatwa or religious edict, probably issued by Iranian clerics, even provides Lebanese Shia drug dealers with a theological basis for their business with Western consumers. Open the quote. We are making drugs for Satan, America and the Jews. If we cannot kill them with guns, so we'll kill them with drugs, close quote. And describing Jews, we already saw Nasrallah describing Jews as descendants of apes and pigs. He continues that statement by the following words. A few million vagabonds from all over the world brought together by their Talmud and Jewish fanaticism, close quote. Al-Manar Television, the movement's main propaganda outlet, is similarly a regular purveyor of openly anti-Jewish sentiment. So in one 2002 broadcast quoted by researcher Matthew Levitt, a guest informs viewers that, and I quote, there are Torah-based reasons for many Americans to use WMD. Therefore, it is essential that there be a world and Arab movement against this Torah-based project. This is a Torah-based plan to finish all Islam, close quote. In another broadcast, also quoted by Levitt, Sheikh Taha al-Sabunji, a leading cleric in northern Lebanon, warned in April 2002 that Judaism was a, quote, a project against all humanity. He also denied the premise, interestingly, on which Hizballah officials had recently begun to express themselves, namely that Zionism was a separate issue from Judaism. Sheikh al-Sabunji says, and I quote, there is no such thing as Zionism, there is only Judaism. Zionism is a legend, a myth, close quote. In 2004, Al-Manar aired a series called Al-Shatat, the Diaspora, which included the concept of blood libel, one of the most notorious, of course, of anti-Semitic libels, which claims that Jews abduct Christian children and use their blood to make the Passover matzah. In the relevant scene, a Jewish rabbi plots to find a sacrificial Christian child. The chosen boy begs for his life, addresses one of the Jews by name, only to have his throat slit and his blood collected for the matzah. Hizbollah's anti-Semitism also makes use of modern-day conspiracy theories, and indeed it's interesting to note that some of these more well-known theories can actually be traced back to the movement itself. Let's say Hizbollah has the patent on a couple of these theories. For example, less than 1 week after 9/11, an Al-Manar broadcast posited that Israelis and Jews were complicit in the attacks. By this account, some 4,000 Jews survived the attacks because Israeli intelligence warned them of the impending disaster ahead of time, and they didn't go to work on September 11th. Those of you who, like me, sometimes spend too much time on the internet, on the darker corners of the internet exploring this kind of stuff, will know that's a very famous theory that now is held to be true by a variety of sadly misguided people. Hizbollah has the patent on it, and as the first example you'll find of that theory is Al-Manar, just a week or so after September 11th itself. Similarly, Hizbollah leaders alternately deny the Holocaust or claim that the Jews themselves intentionally incited it. In 1998, Mohammad Raid, the head of Hizbollah Political Council, says, I quote, "From what we know of the Jews, their tricks and their deceptions, we do not think it unlikely that they partook in the planning of the Holocaust. At a minimum, they prepared the foreground which incited the Nazis to the Holocaust killings so they could serve their settlement project in Palestine," close quote. Hizbollah's anti-Semitism also sometimes achieves a certain farcical or comic effect, at least if you have a particular kind of sense of humor, which you tend to develop after some years of dealing with this stuff in any case. For example, In 2014, Al-Manar aired a program claiming that Jews had invented a number of Hollywood movies and even Hollywood itself in order to subversively insert Jewish superiority into American and global culture. Because, says the narrator in the program, Jews felt rejected by real American society, and she continues, they tried to change society's opinion of them by inventing cinematic characters that would serve as role models, close quote. Which is the example that the narrator brings of this phenomenon. She cites the example of Superman, who only fit into society, of course, thus she says, by taking on the pathetic persona. She says that, not me. I like Clark Kent. Yeah, the pathetic persona of Clark Kent. The Jews, according to the narrator, thus slyly implied that their weak public face hid their true superhuman identity. Hollywood, she says, is a Jewish invention that changed the way Americans view America. Undoubtedly, she concludes, the goal was to take over the greatest superpower in the world, close quotes. Now, this, of course, to Western ears sounds somewhat ridiculous. But it's worth remembering that there's something serious lurking behind this patent absurdity. And that is the unfortunate fact that the Arabic-speaking world in 2014, as when that show came out, or in 2019, is a milieu in which anti-Jewish prejudice is normative and mainstream. All available polling, as some people here may be aware, emphatically supports this unfortunate point, which in any case I think becomes very apparent to anybody who spends any appreciable amount of time, if you know Arabic language, in the Arabic-speaking world. As the late Bernard Lewis said, the societal norm for attitudes towards Jews in the Arab world resembles that of pre-1939 Europe. That is to say, Europe before the series of events which led, at least for a time, to anti-Jewish prejudice being declared out of bounds, so to speak, in polite company. What this means is that much of the evidence that I've been quoting here would be regarded as unremarkable in contemporary mainstream Arabic discourse among both friends of Hizballah and indeed its opponents. This doesn't in any way lessen, of course, the openly and blatantly anti-Semitic nature of this content. The evidence, the examples rather, which I quoted above are just a small sample. The evidence for this kind of stuff as part of the mainstream discourse of Hizballah is overwhelming. In this regard, then, I want to start to mention a couple of other factors which I think need to be featured, so to speak, in our attempt to understand this phenomenon. It's worth mentioning here the traditional emphasis in Shia Islam on questions of ritual purity. Tahara, similar to the Hebrew word for those who know Hebrew, toha in Hebrew of purity, tahara in Arabic, and najasat. Among strict Shia, traditionally, non-Muslims were included in the list of unclean things, contact with which produced a state of ritual impurity in Muslims. Along, by the way, on the list with such substances as wine, pigs, carrion, fecal matter, and so on. Iranian Shia authorities were traditionally extremely strict on this matter. And as a result, in the early 19th century, in areas under their control, restrictive rules were imposed on Jews, preventing them, for example, from going out when it was raining, lest their impurities pass on to Muslims through the water. Now, by the early 20th century, such practices were falling into steep decline. It's possible, by the way, that the reason for the prevalence or presence of these theories in Shia Islam, they're quite absent from Sunni Islam, by the way, is because of the influence of Zoroastrianism on some Shia theology. This is at least one theory. These notions, however, having been in decline in the late 19th, early 20th century, were revived by Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution. In a widely circulated book on the subject, Ayatollah Khomeini included unbelievers in a list he devised or formulated of items deemed unclean, also including carrion, wine, beer, feces, urine, and so on. The Iranian Shia Islamist milieu, which has revived these notions, is the one of which Hizballah is a part. So this context should be taken into account when considering the movement's attitudes to Jews. Those with knowledge of Shia communities in Pakistan, in Iraq, and of course also in Lebanon, will be aware of the strength which such perceptions still have, unfortunately, at the popular level. Yet with all this, it's also the case, particularly in recent years, that statements of this kind quoted earlier, or the kind I was quoting a few minutes ago, have been leavened with protestations of an absence of anti-Jewish prejudice in the movement, insofar as the Jews are seen as a people of the book, with a recognized, if subaltern, position in the properly ordered Islamic society, which is Hizballah's goal. Yeah. Hizballah are trying to call me to claim that they're being unfairly slandered in this forum. So, and it's nice that we have it at that moment, because now I'm trying to, this is the case for the defense, so to speak, which I'm about to try to give. There's a number of statements which I want to give here, which are claims by the movement in spite of the welter of evidence which I've already put forward, which is, by the way, of course, only a tip of the iceberg. There are a number of claims by the movement denying any existence of anti-Jewish prejudice. This is the paradox, which I want to, in this latter part of the talk, go on to try to focus on. So, on 30th November 2009, while reading the party's new political manifesto, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah declares, quote, "Our problem with the Israelis is not that they are Jews, but that they are occupiers who are raping our land and holy places," close quote. In a pro-Palestinian convention held in Beirut in 2005, Hizballah representative in the Lebanese parliament, Abdullah Qusseir, states that, quote, "Hizballah has never been against religions. Hizballah supports all religions. Hizballah supports interfaith dialogue, and it has no problem with any religion. Hizballah considers Zionism to be the enemy, not the Jews as a people or religion." Similarly, commenting on a recent project for the renovation of the Magen Avraham synagogue in Beirut, Hussein Rahal, a spokesman for Hizballah, said that the group supported the renovation of the synagogue, and he says, "We respect the Jewish religion just like we do Christianity. The Jews have always lived among us. We have an issue only with Israel's occupation of land," close quote. How then to explain this discrepancy between, on the one hand, the obvious and openly stated statements expressing the deepest hostility to Jews as Jews, and then, secondly, these public statements denying all existence of such sentiment? Amal Saad Ghorayeb does this, or attempts this, in an interesting way. What she does, and what she describes in her book, is she notes that the form of coexistence advocated by Hizballah is of a particular minimal kind. In an interview conducted in Beirut with a Hizballah official, Ali Fayyad, Saad Ghorayeb concludes that the movement, quote, "is compelled to abide by the dictates of Islamic jurisprudence and therefore to recognize the Jews as a people of the book, who, despite their demonization in the Quran, cannot be the subject of a jihad on that account alone," close quote. Fayyad discusses the concept, which I've only heard him use these words, but he calls it, in Arabic, it's al-tasakun al-barid, or cold cohabitation with the Jews, whereby, according to Saad Ghorayeb, quoting Fayyad, "the Jews would be left to live in peace because the conflict between the Jews and Islam is essentially ideological as opposed to existential, as in the case of Zionism. However, there will be no normalization with them. This," she goes on to note, "is in contrast to Fayyad's concept of Tayyush al-Mushtarak, or joint coexistence, which would take place between Muslims and Christians." Does this then solve the contradiction? I would suggest that it does not do so entirely, since this picture, according to which a Jewish collectivity stripped of political and military capacities and therefore rendered harmless, would subsequently be left alone to practice its rituals, leaves out an additional element increasingly prevalent in the theology both of Hizballah and of the larger Iranian and pro-Iranian Shia Islamist world of which it is a part, namely the eschatological or end of days element in this thinking. In this regard, it's interesting to go back to the quote of Nasrallah, which I read at the beginning, and to note that this was not merely a generalized call for the destruction of the Jews. Rather, it was the outlining of a very specific end times scenario. Let's just remember the quote once again. So Nasrallah says the following: "But I'll tell you, among the signs and signals which guide us in the Islamic prophecies is that this state of Israel will be established, the Jews will gather from all parts of the world into occupied Palestine." And here he says, not in order to bring about the Dajjal, the Antichrist, and the end of the world, but rather that Allah, the glorified and Most High, wants, etc., etc., etc. What end times was Nasrallah discussing there? To what was he referring? He was referring to the scenario according to which the 12th Imam, or Imam Mahdi, returns to earth to do battle with his enemies and launch the end days of the world. Within Twelver or Imami Shiism, the dominant stream of Shiism, to which Hizballah is a part, the beliefs in the coming of the Messiah focus upon the figure of the 12th Imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, who tradition claims disappeared and went into occultation in 873 CE or AD. The notion is that the Mahdi's return will result in a series of battles between the Mahdi and firstly Abu Sufyan, who is identified as an Arab ruler hostile to the Mahdi. By the way, during the Iran-Iraq war, there were those who identified Abu Sufyan as Saddam Hussein. And then with the Dajjal, the deceiver or the Antichrist, who is often associated with the Jews or with Israel in contemporary Shia Islamist writing. The Mahdi will of course be victorious and will then establish a messianic state encompassing the world. His enemies will be destroyed in their entirety. According to David Cook, in a 2011 essay entitled Messianism in the Shiite Crescent, I'm quoting Cook now, the Dajjal, or the Antichrist, is another key figure in Muslim apocalyptic literature. Since the Dajjal is said to be a Jew, contemporary writers often use this figure to inject anti-Semitic conspiracy thinking into mainstream apocalyptic writings. The Dajjal was virtually absent in traditional Shiite writings, although nowadays the figure is gaining more and more prominence in contemporary Shiite apocalyptic materials. Indeed, Dajjal's stories have become loci for demonizing the West as a whole, which is routinely portrayed as the embodiment of the Antichrist. Furthermore, anti-Semitic references to the Dajjal regularly appear today in Shiite apocalyptic literature. Only a few years ago, such references were non-existent. Close quote from Cook. Shiite apocalyptic thinking was prominent during the 1979 revolutionary period. It declined following the death of Khomeini, and it was revived. It has undergone a significant revival during the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in Iran. As Cook notes, I'm quoting him again, it was a correspondingly minor presence in the literature of Hizballah over the first couple of decades of its existence, but it has emerged into greater prominence over the last decade and a half. And Cook says, while Shiite Islam has always possessed an elaborate literature concerning the Mahdi, never before has this literature been as copious, publicly available, detailed, or socially explosive in terms of its stress on the imminence of the Mahdi's return as it is today. Close quote. Hizballah routinely utilized tropes that are traditionally Shia. For example, the martyr Hussein is frequently utilized by Hizballah as a revolutionary model to be emulated. But the movement's ideologues in the first years of the movement initially placed little emphasis on the revelation of the Mahdi. This has changed since approximately 2004, when a flood of books about the Mahdi began to spring from the popular presses of Beirut. These books have aimed to not only introduce classical prophecies about the Mahdi to ever wider audiences, but they've also provided religiously charged interpretations of contemporary events in terms of the Mahdi's imminent return, designed to compel readers to not only study and learn, but to take action. For example, prior to 2000, there were virtually no references, you can find virtually no references to the Mahdi's appearance in Hizballah's resistance literature concerning Israel. Yet following the 2006 war between Israel and Hizballah, Hizballah published a record of the miraculous occurrences that took place during the war, and the Mahdi is featured or features prominently in these accounts, such as the following anecdote, and I'm quoting here from a translation of a book about these miraculous occurrences in the course of the 2006 war. Quote, "One of us began to pray the ordained prayer during the midday, when a man giving off rays of light appeared to him. The fighter said to him in surprise and fear, 'Who are you? How did you get here?' The man said, 'I am the Imam al-Hujjah, the Imam Mahdi, your master. I appear by the permission of God to our supporters whenever I wish and in whatever place, and I would like to speak with you.' And the fighter replied, 'My master, I'm not alone, but there are other fighters in position.' And the man guided the Mahdi to the other fighters. And just at that moment, the Zionists approached with their tanks and bulldozers. And when Israeli missiles began to rain towards the three fighters, the Mahdi pointed with his hand, and one of the missiles fell upon an Israeli tank instead. Then the three fighters began to attack the other tanks, and one of them succeeded in firing an RPG right at it and destroyed it. Then the Imam Mahdi called out to the fighters, saying to them, 'Now retreat.' And the fighters retreated, but they were victorious with his divine help." This quote is from Majid Nasr al-Zabidi. The name of the book is Karamat al-Wad al-Sadiq, Tawthiq al-Nasa al-Ilahi al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya fi Lubnan, which means something like the wonders or miracles of the faithful promise. Al-Wad al-Sadiq. This is the name of the 2006 war which Hizballah uses, the faithful promise. What was the promise, by the way? People are probably familiar. The promise was that the war was conducted in order to achieve the freeing of a number of Hizballah prisoners from Israeli jails, including, of course, the late and, I hope in this context at least, unlamented Samir Kuntar, among others. The name will be familiar to those who need to be familiar with it. This element and the growing importance of Shia messianic thinking in Hizballah is paralleled by similar trends in the broader milieu of the Shia militia movements elsewhere, also notably in Iraq. It's clear that it adds an additional layer to the movement's existing anti-Jewish outlook. This extra layer should not, in my view, be ignored, and it calls into question whether Amal Saad Ghorayev's view of Hizballah as envisaging Tasakun al-Barid, remember, cold coexistence with the Jews, with a defeated and politically neutered Jewish community at least, whether this view can be sustained. So, to conclude, a number of points to sum up. The Lebanese Hizballah organization adheres to an ideology which has at its core a version of anti-Zionism which is inherently anti-Jewish, locating what it regards as the criminal nature of Zionism and Israel in what it sees as the uniquely criminal and evil and iniquitous nature of the Jews. While on an ideological level, this version of anti-Semitism may differ from other contemporary versions of both anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, in practice, this ideological formulation is accompanied by the adoption by the movement of more familiar tropes of modern anti-Semitism, including Holocaust denial. As an Islamic movement, Hizballah is required to deal with the notion of the Jews as a people of the book and therefore entitled to an ordered, if subordinate, role in an Islamic society. Hizballah spokesmen do this by taking a minimal interpretation of this role for Jews, not for Christians, by the way, according to which Jews will be left unmolested under Islamic rule without being permitted to take an equal or active role in society and under permanent suspicion and hostility. But the growth in popularity of messianic and eschatological movements and thinking in Hizballah statements and publications over the last decade and a half indicate that even this fate appears to be considered excessively generous and positive for the Jews in Hizballah's view. Instead, the increasingly popular view sees the Jews as part of an upcoming final battle between good and evil, in which evil, and therefore in this case represented by the Jews, will be defeated and destroyed. Finally, and on this I'll conclude, it's important to remember that Hizballah emerges from, and indeed is the creation and franchise of, a particular Iranian Shia Islamist outlook. This outlook has in turn sought to revive a particular, specifically Shia type of anti-Jewish prejudice, which locates Jews as a source of ritual impurity. In this regard, in considering the specific and interesting, I hope at least, form of Hizballah's anti-Semitism, it's important always to bear in mind this thing which I stressed at the beginning, which is that this movement is a franchise of a larger Iran-led power structure. So study of its outlook regarding the Jews and Israel is useful also in locating the views on this subject of that larger, powerful and increasingly consequential regional alliance. So on that note, I'll be quiet and I'll be very happy. We have about 15 minutes left to take some questions. Thank you very much. Thanks. Yes. So who would like to learn more, to know some more about this, or to take issue with what I've said, or anything else? Please, anybody. Yes.
So I just have a question pertaining. So you stated in your talk that Hizballah is a faction of the Shia Muslim community, correct?
Yeah.
So I wanted to hear your take if whether or not the Sunnis were equally as bad or equally anti-Semitic, or if they were less anti-Semitic in comparison to the Shia.
Mm. Well, you know, Sunni Islamist movements, and we can think of examples such as Muslim Brotherhood or Al-Qaeda or obviously Islamic State, are equally anti-Jewish and probably in some ways more overtly anti-Christian than the Shia Islamist movements are. And that's because for various reasons, Hizballah and others try to draw this distinction between Jews and Christians, which is not really supported in Islamic texts, but they want to say that Jews are much, much worse than Christians and Christians are not so bad. And that is because Hizballah wants to align itself politically with certain Christian political forces in Lebanon. So they have to come up with this distinction. The Sunni Islamists tend not to bother with that. They put Christians and Jews in the same very negative definition. And if we think of Islamic State, if we remember when Islamic State, and also Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, when they come across, there's no Jews left in Syria, of course, anymore, but when they come across Christian communities, they try to either expel them or forcibly convert them. So the Sunnis are more consistent than the Shia in that respect. Sunni political Islam is equally anti-Jewish as Shia political Islam, but it does differ in a number of interesting ways because Sunni Islam is different to Shia Islam, and specifically the ones which I noted in the talk are the ones I think to bear in mind. There is this element, this issue of najasat, of impurity, of the Jews or unbelievers as a whole as sources of ritual impurity, which is very, very strong, also on a folkloric level among Shia Arab communities. That just doesn't exist among the Sunnis. They don't have any of that. And the reason for that, I think, or this is what Bernard Lewis and others claimed, is because the origins of that among the Shia are not in Islam. They're actually in the presence, in the areas from where Shia Islam first became strong, of certain non-Islamic traditions for whom this issue of ritual purity and ritual impurity is very strong. And these ideas have found their way into Shia Islam as a result of that, but they've not found their way into Sunni Islam. So you won't find Sunni, for example, you won't find in the Sunni Muslim world any such notion that, when it rains, unbelievers have to stay inside, Christians and Jews have to stay inside, because their impure nature will come off from the water and then infect Muslims, right? This would be regarded as ridiculous by Sunni Muslims. But I can assure you that in Shia areas, and I have this on much anecdotal evidence as well, and personal knowledge, this is a very strongly held belief. So in this respect, not more anti-Semitic or less, but different, yeah? And I would say with regard to the messianic element as well, the issue of return of Imam Mahdi and this notion of a final apocalyptic battle between the Muslims and their enemies. There is a Sunni messianic or apocalyptic trend as well, but it's quite different to that one. So the answer is the Sunni Islamists are not less anti-Jewish and certainly not less anti-Christian than the Shia Islamists, but their philosophies and their ideologies are quite different in some interesting ways. Yes, please.
My family's been in Iran for 2,700 years before, and we left in 78, right before the Islamic Revolution. And my grandmother was telling me stories of growing up under the Qajar dynasty, where Jews were considered into that, and the fact that she couldn't go out when it would rain, drink from the drinking fountains, go to the bazaar to buy food because of the fact that they were considered ritually impure. My mother's generation grew up under Mohammed Reza Pahlavi, who came into power in 41, and it was very different then because it became secular. So she went to a very prominent school called Madinat Ittifaq, which was a secular Jewish school that even Muslims would send their kids because it was such a good school. But she would say, even though the Jews became Rish lived in northern Tehran, the janitors would still only wear gloves because they were coming from the countryside. They were very religious Shias, and they still wouldn't touch the food or have any physical contact with the Jewish kids. And then Khomeini, people have said, the Jewish community again in Iran, who's still about 10,000 left, has said Khomeini brought all of that back. It was always there. He just made it okay to start believing it again. My question to you is about, first of all, thank you. My question to you is about Hezbollah. Being that Hezbollah has supported Bashar al-Assad in his killing of their civilians, do you feel that at one point Hezbollah was really seen, I remember Pakistani had Hezbollah flags, they were seen as going against the bully being Israel and America. Do you feel that Hezbollah has gained less of a popularity because they are now basically in the same boat with Bashar al-Assad, to the point where Nasrallah is not showing these martyr videos of these men being killed coming back from Syria because it looks so bad for them PR-wise?
Thanks both for the question and the contribution. Just to add to the personal story that you were telling, I can say from living in Jerusalem and having many friends who came from parts of the Arab world which were largely Shia, and specifically many people from southern Iraq, that similar stories are very familiar. I remember the father of a friend of mine describing how he, as a boy in the market in Baghdad, was taken by an uncle to buy fruit, and on one occasion, he was of course a kid, he took a couple of grapes from a box to eat them, and then the owner of the market stall was very angry with the uncle and said, listen, you understand I've got to throw the whole box away now, right? Because you're not controlling this kid properly. In other words, because the Jewish kid had taken 2 grapes from the box, the whole box was now ritually impure and dirty and had to be thrown away. This stuff was very, very deep at one time, and as you correctly said, declined for a while and was then brought back by political Islam, which has overtly sought to revive it. With regard to Hizballah and whether Hezbollah's intervention in the Syrian war has cost it some of its kind of pan-Islamic legitimacy that it had out of the pre-2000 war and then the 2006 war, the answer is undoubtedly yes, and this is something which is supported by all available polling. Nasrallah went from being a pan-Islamic figure, seen as the guy who had finally delivered a military blow to Israel and so on, to being a despised Shia Islamist figure. Absolutely correct. And it's something which I've personally witnessed. I remember in northern Syria, I went to Syria during the war, first time in Idlib province in February 2012. And the rebels, supporters of the rebels there, were burning Hizballah flags in the town square. And I thought, this is interesting. And I took some pictures of it and was looking forward to showing people and publish them back home. And then I asked one of the guys, by the way, you're burning all these Hizballah flags, yeah? How do you come to have all these Hizballah flags to burn in the first place? Yeah? And he said, well, of course we have them because in 2006 we were waving them in celebration of Hizballah fighting Israel. So now we don't like Hizballah anymore. We've got a nice supply of flags to burn. So absolutely yes. As a result of that intervention, they suffered in terms of popularity. But two things to note about this. Firstly, Hizballah had no choice but to intervene in Syria. This was a red line, so to speak, which they were given by the Iranians. Because had Bashar Assad fallen, as he would have fallen, in my view, without, among other things, the Iranian intervention and Hizbollah's intervention, Hizballah would have faced a terrible fate, because Hizballah would have at that point been cut off in Lebanon, and next door would have been a very big and powerful Sunni Islamist government in Damascus, among the first of whose items on their agenda would have been to take revenge on Hizballah. So they acted, one, because they're an Iranian franchise, but secondly, out of their own self-interest. They had no choice, in spite of the cost. But secondly, I would say we need to be careful about something. Yeah, it's true, they had enormous legitimacy, and then that legitimacy was lost. I would suggest that it wouldn't necessarily take all that long for that legitimacy to be regained. I would suggest that if we see Hizballah going to war against Israel again in some context or another, you could well see, at least on a popular level, probably not on a governmental level, but at least on a popular level, in large parts of the Sunni Arab world, you would find support for Hizballah in that instance, certainly among Sunni Islamist circles, who of course were the backbone of the Syrian rebellion. Certainly among those circles, they would rapidly, I think, come to support Hizballah if it's fighting against the Jews and the Christians. Anybody else? Yes, please.
I want to know the attitudes of the Christian political factions in Lebanon towards it.
Yeah, the Christians in Lebanon are a divided political force. All right? This is one of the reasons for their extreme weakness today. It's not the only reason. They're also in demographic decline. Many of them have left, but they're divided broadly. If we think of the two big movements, at least broadly, between the Lebanese forces of Samir Jaja, Dr. Samir Jaja on the one hand, and the Free Patriotic Movement of General Michel Aoun on the other. Now, Aoun's movement is probably, at this stage, the best organized of the Christian political movements, and Aoun is in alliance with Hizballah. Aoun today is, in fact, president of Lebanon as a result of the support of Hizballah. Now, it might seem strange because for those of us, or some of us maybe here also like me, are old enough to remember the late 80s and early 1990s. We remember General Michel Aoun entering the stage of history as a patriotic Lebanese army general who is fighting against the Syrians to try to ensure Lebanese independence, and then he ends up working for Hizballah. The answer is that, yeah, it is strange, but Lebanon is a very strange place, and nobody should ever confuse political principle with the behavior of most Lebanese politicians. Aoun wanted to be president. Aoun saw an interest in going with Hizballah, so he's done so. On a deeper level, if you travel in Lebanon and talk to Lebanese Christians, there is a whole ideology of among Lebanese Christians which expresses a great fear of Sunni political Islam, and which will tell you, well, Hariri and the Mustaqbal movement was in league with Saudi Arabia. We as Christians are more frightened of the Sunnis than the Shia, because if you look at Saudi Arabia, there's no churches, you can't worship freely, whereas with Hizballah, X and Y. I would recommend not taking too much of that at face value either. Friends of mine who know the Christians of the region better than I say that you have to know a Christian Arab or a Middle Eastern Christian about 15 years before he'll even consider telling you what he really thinks about anything. Right? These are communities that have a long, long history as minorities of not necessarily expressing their true views and having a very cautious view of their interests. But the bottom line is the Christians are, the Christian communities in Lebanon are divided politically, and as a result have in many ways ceased to be significant players. Today the significant players, in many ways today, the only really significant player in Lebanon is Hizballah. I would go as far as to suggest that. But 10 years ago, when there was a maybe significant opposition to Hizballah. It was, of course, led by and consisted of Lebanese Sunni Muslims, and that was the competition. We have, I think, time for one last question if somebody would like to ask it. Oh, yes, please.
Not talking in Europe about the financial crisis that people are facing right now. So you stand on that?
Yeah, I tend to be a little bit skeptical about a lot of this. It's true that there have been indications of cuts in payments to fighters and so on. You can find the anecdotal evidence, but at least in my view, we need to be aware of a number of things. The idea that sanctions on the Iranian economy are going to, in their entirety, cut off funds for the muqawma, the resistance, of which Lebanese Hizballah is, of course, a central part, need to be qualified for two reasons. One is that we remember prior to July 2015, when Iran was under very serious sanctions, prior to JCPOA being signed, yeah? And that was exactly the time when billions of dollars were found to provide for the intervention to save Bashar Assad in Syria. So, you know, the resistance part of the economy tends to find its own funds, even if the other economy is genuinely suffering. We know this from the past. The other reason is the following, and I think this is a crucial point. Because we as the West, let's say, have been so complacent for so many years about Iran's expansion across the region. Today, if you want to cut off Iranian sources of funding for resistance activity, it's not enough to sanction the Iranian economy, because the Iranians also have their tentacles deep into the Iraqi economy, deep into the Lebanese economy, and with a whole black economy, if one could put it that way, you know, off the books economy, yeah, of straw companies and informally associated companies dealing down in the Gulf who are able to provide money for the Iranians. By the way, also the Turkish banking system has been involved in ensuring Iranian money, free movement of money across the region. So the answer is, if somebody thinks that Hizballah is being starved of funds to a point where it actually starts to impact on the movement's ability to perform or ability to control its own local population, I think that person is misguided. Sure. Yes, thank you very much.